So we are going to begin a new study on the book of Hebrews. So this message today is primarily to kind of provide an overview and an introduction to this letter to the Hebrews. Now, you've probably realized, if you've been with us any amount of time on a Sunday morning, that I am a big fan of the Bible Project and the videos and the content that they produce. So, as we begin to explore the letter to the Hebrews, I want to introduce it with their overview of the letter to the Hebrews. So I'm going to share that with you now.
The letter to the Hebrews. The author of this letter is anonymous, and people have wondered for a long time whether Paul wrote it or maybe one of his co-workers like Barnabas or Apollos, but really we just don't know. In chapter 2, we discover that the author had a first-hand relationship with the disciples who were themselves around Jesus, so we know that this letter is anchored in the teaching of the apostles. We also don't know who the audience of this letter was, or even where they lived. The author knows them really well, and he assumes that they have a thorough knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, especially the storyline of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, about how Abraham's family became the nation of Israel, about how Moses led them out of slavery in Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they received the Torah, and they made a covenant with God, where they built the tabernacle, where the priests offered sacrifices, and also about how they wandered through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. The author just expects that the readers know all of the details about these stories, and so most likely the audience is made up of Jewish Christians. That's where the name of the letter comes from. We also have clues from chapter 10 that this church community was facing persecution and even imprisonment because of their association with Jesus. Some in the community were walking away from Jesus and abandoning the faith altogether. And this explains the purpose and the structure of this letter. First, there's a short introduction, which is followed by 4 sections where the author compares and contrasts Jesus with key people and events from Israel's history. Jesus is first compared with angels in the Torah, second with Moses and the Promised Land, third with priests and Melchizedek, and lastly with the sacrifices and the covenant. And the author has 2 main goals in all of these contrasts. The first goal is to elevate Jesus as superior to anyone or anything else, showing that Jesus is worthy of all their trust and devotion. But his second goal is this: it's to challenge the readers to remain faithful to Jesus despite persecution. So in every section, he includes a strong warning not to abandon Jesus. So let's dive in now and see how this all unfolds. The elevation of Jesus begins in the opening sentence of the introduction. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors in many different ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. So the author's saying that Jesus is superior to all of the previous ways that God has revealed himself to Israel. He then makes this astounding claim that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's nature. These metaphors are making the closest possible identification between Jesus and God. So Jesus is what the rays of light are to the sun, or Jesus is what the wax impression is to the signet ring. For this author, there is no God apart from Jesus. Jesus is God become human as the Son. And it's this elevated view of Jesus that's then explored throughout the rest of the letter. In the first section, the author compares Jesus with angels, which might strike you as kind of odd, like why angels? In Jewish tradition, it was taught, based on Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2, that the Torah and the words of God were delivered to Moses at Mount Sinai by angels. And so by saying that Jesus is superior to angels, the author is claiming that Jesus and his message of good news are superior to all previous messengers of God's word. And so the first warning flows from this very point. If Israel was called to pay attention to the Torah that was delivered by angels, how much more should we pay attention to the message that was announced by the Son of God? And not only that, given Jesus' status high above the angels, how remarkable is it that he gave up that high status to become human, to suffer, and to die? In Jesus, we see God's greatest glory and God's great humility as Jesus sympathetically joined himself to humanity's tragic fate. In chapters 3 and 4, the author moves on to argue that Jesus is superior to Moses, who led the people of Israel through the wilderness and built the tabernacle. Jesus is also the leader of God's people, but in him we see not the builder of just a tent, but of all creation. Then the author retells the story of how the Israelites rebelled against Moses in the wilderness, and they lost their chance to enter into the rest that God offered them in the promised land. And so here comes the second warning. If Jesus is greater than Moses, how much higher are the stakes if we rebel against him? We also are in a wilderness-like environment where we have to trust God for the future rest in God's new creation. So let's make sure that we don't rebel like Israel did in the wilderness and lose out on God's gracious offer to enter his new creation. In chapters 5 through 7, the author then compares Jesus with Israel's priests that come from the line of Aaron. Their role was to represent Israel before God and to offer sacrifices that atoned for or covered over the sins of the people. But, he points out, the priests were themselves morally flawed people, and so they constantly had to offer sacrifices for their own sins as well as for everybody else's. Something more was needed. And so he then argues that Jesus was that something more. He's the ultimate priest. But Jesus did not come from the line of Aaron. Rather, Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, that mysterious priest king from ancient Jerusalem, and he appears in the stories about Abraham. We also find in Psalm 110 that the Messianic king from the line of David will be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So the author's whole point is this. Jesus is the ultimate priest king. He's morally flawless, he's eternally available for his people, and so he's superior to any other mediator between God and humans. And thus comes his warning in this section. To reject Jesus is to reject one's best and only chance to be fully reconciled to God, so don't do that. Which transitions us into the last comparison in chapters 8 through 10. The author shows how Jesus' death on the cross was the ultimate sacrifice, superior to all the animal sacrifices offered in the temple. Those sacrifices had to be offered constantly, both daily but also yearly on the Day of Atonement. Jesus offered his life once and for all, and it was sufficient to cover the sins of the whole world. And so the author warns the audience from walking away from Jesus. It's like turning your back on a gracious offer of God's forgiveness. Why would you do that? Jesus' sacrifice is permanent, he says, and it's the foundation for the new covenant spoken of in the prophets, where all sins are forgiven. So now that the author has elevated Jesus through all of these contrasts, this final section is one big challenge to follow Jesus. So think big picture. In Jesus, they have found God's very word. In Jesus, they have hope for the new creation. Jesus is their eternal priest. He's the perfect sacrifice. And so now they should follow all the great models of faith found throughout the story of the scriptures, and they should remain faithful to Jesus, trusting that despite whatever hardship and persecution, God will not abandon his people. That's the basic flow of thought throughout the letter, which the author calls right here at the very end a brief word of exhortation. Here's a couple of extra tips for reading this letter. Whenever the author quotes from the Old Testament scriptures, which is like every other sentence, stop and go look up the reference and read that quotation in its original context. And sometimes you'll be puzzled, but more often you'll see all kinds of extra cool connections that you would never notice otherwise. It's totally worth the effort. You should also just know that these warning passages, they're going to make you uncomfortable, and that's kind of the point. They're not there to make you afraid. They're there to show you that rejecting Jesus is foolish because he's so awesome. These warnings all serve the larger purpose of the letter, to show that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God's love and mercy. And that's what the letter of the Hebrews is all about.
All right, so that overview poster is available on the cart in the foyer. If you'd like a copy, go ahead and take one of those. It's kind of, I find, a helpful graphical way to understand what the letter of Hebrews is about. So those are on the cart in the foyer. So just to review some of what was shared in the video, the author of this letter to the Hebrews is unknown. It could be the Apostle Paul, but it's more likely that it was one of Paul's associates, one of the men who traveled with Paul as a co-worker, someone like Barnabas or Apollos. And we find there's an interesting bit of information about the author in chapter 2. In chapter 2, we understand that the author of the Hebrew letter had a firsthand relationship with the disciples who are around Jesus. So, again, we don't know for sure who wrote the letter, but we know that what was written was anchored in the teaching of Jesus. And so the good thing for us then is that Hebrews, it's all about Jesus. And Jesus is the starting point for the letter to the Hebrews. It's kind of also unclear who the intended audience was or where they lived. It's not entirely clear, but it does seem that the author knew his readers well. He made some assumptions then in knowing his readers, and he assumed that, for example, they had a very thorough knowledge of the Hebrew Scriptures, especially the Torah. So that's what we would call the Old Testament. In particular, the first 5 books of our Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So the author here, he's kind of assuming these guys have all of that well in view. Perhaps many of them memorized large portions, if not all, of those books. And so the author then, he expects his readers to know these stories about Abraham and his family, the details of the Exodus, the leaving of Egypt, and then the wandering around through the wilderness and coming to Mount Sinai, and ultimately Israel's kind of failure to trust God, to take him at his word, and to be obedient. And so it's for this reason that a lot of people then think that the letter was originally intended for those who were Jewish Christians. They were Jewish, they knew the law, but they had become followers of Jesus. And so that kind of explains the title, the letter to the Hebrews. Now, I use the word help to say it was to help these Jewish Christians, because we have some clues from chapter 10. And from chapter 10, we see that this community of believers is suffering. They are facing persecution. They are experiencing imprisonment. And it's all because of their faith in Jesus. It's because they are known as people of the way. And as such, there's a whole various group of people who are against them, who are out to cause suffering and hardship. And this suffering and hardship that they're experiencing, it was causing some in that community of faith to actually abandon their faith. They were thinking like, well, following Jesus is hard. Maybe if we just kind of let go of Jesus and don't follow him, maybe go back to our old ways in Judaism, maybe that'll be easier. Maybe that'll be better. And so the author knows this, and he's writing to kind of call them back to faith, or to encourage them to remain steadfast in their faith, to never leave in the first place. So leaving an all-sufficient Savior, going back to old ways, that's not going to work. And so all of this serves to set up the reason for the author to write what he did. And so as we work through this letter to the Hebrews, we're going to see the author making a number of comparisons and contrasts between Jesus. Jesus really sits at the center of all of this letter to the Hebrews. So compare and contrast Jesus with the history of Israel and their practices, what it meant to be a Jew, in other words. And so then throughout all the comparisons that make up the main body of the letter, we kind of see the author really expressing 2 main goals. First, he wants to elevate Jesus to the highest level, to make it really clear that Jesus is superior to anyone and anything else. Jesus is above all. And he's going to, in doing that, show that because Jesus is superior to anyone and everyone, he is then worthy of our complete and total trust and devotion. Second, then, we'll see the author challenging those believers, and then in a sense challenging us to remain faithful to Jesus regardless of our life circumstances. If I asked, well, let's just do this. Has life ever been hard? Raise your hand. I don't know if that's everybody, but it's most of the people that I could see. At some point, life has been challenging or difficult. And when that happens, I find that we start to ask these more existential questions. We start to say, why, God? Why me? Why now? Why this? Why this hardship? Why this suffering? When our lives don't go the way we hope or expect, and we try to hold on to a God that we know is good and loving, there's some tension there. And we wonder, how can these things be true? How can God love me and my life is so hard? And so it's kind of into that the author of Hebrews is speaking. And ultimately, he's going to say that in Jesus, regardless of the circumstances, you will have all that you need for this life and the life to come. And so it's for those reasons that after he offers these comparisons and contrasts, he then also offers a warning to not abandon Jesus, to never give up, to never quit on Jesus. And so if I were to summarize the entire letter of Hebrews in just a couple of sentences, this is what I would say. Jesus is the clearest and fullest and most ultimate revelation of God. And as such, he is worthy of our trust and devotion. Following Jesus means remaining faithful to him despite suffering or hardship, because we know that God will not abandon his people. If I were to summarize Hebrews with just one word, it would be Jesus. Hebrews is about Jesus. In Hebrews chapters 1 and 2, Jesus will be compared to angels and the Torah. And the elevation of Jesus as being superior to both of these, it begins right away in the opening line of Hebrews. Hebrews 1 says this: in the past, God spoke to our ancestors in many different ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. And so the author is saying here that Jesus is superior to all the previous ways in which God has revealed himself to humanity. The author then goes on to make a quite astounding claim about Jesus when he says this: the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of his nature. And so these two metaphors, radiance and imprint, they're making this comparison that Jesus and God, they're like this. They are completely connected. And you can look at one and know and see the other. And so that means that Jesus is the one true creator, become human as the Son. Now, comparing Jesus to angels, that does perhaps seem a bit odd, as the video said. But again, in Jewish tradition, it was taught that the Torah and the words that God delivered to Moses on Mount Sinai, that they were delivered by angels. Now, next week, I'm going to talk a little bit about angels, what they are not. But one thing I can tell you today is that this word that we use, angel, it means messenger. And so that makes a lot of sense, right? That God would use one of his messengers, one of his representatives, to communicate truth and reveal himself. So by saying that Jesus is superior to angels, the author is claiming that Jesus and his message of good news and the kingdom that he is bringing are completely superior to any previous revelation or message of God. And then follows the very first warning that comes out of that key point. If Israel was called to pay attention to God's word delivered by angels, how much more then should we now pay attention to the message announced by the Son of God? All right, so that's the first warning. And not only that, but given Jesus' status as being far superior and above angels, how remarkable is it? How amazing and astounding is it that Jesus, who is superior to angels, would give up that status for a time to become human, to suffer, and to die on the cross. And so in Jesus, what we see then is God's great glory and at the same time God's humility as he sympathetically joined himself to our tragic fate. Then in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, Jesus will be compared to Moses and the promised land, this covenant, this promise that God had made. In chapters 3 and 4, it's going to argue that Jesus is superior to Moses, who led the Israelites through the wilderness and built the tabernacle, a dwelling place for God. Now, Jesus is also a leader of God's people, but in Jesus we see not just the builder of a tent, the tabernacle, but we see the builder, the creator of all creation. And so the author, he's going to retell the story of how the Israelites rebelled against Moses in the wilderness, how they didn't trust God, they didn't trust Moses, and so they lost their chance to enter into the promised land. And it's from that point that we'll see the second warning. that if Jesus is greater than Moses, and the stakes are then so much higher if we rebel against Jesus. And so we, because of sin, are in a similar kind of wilderness environment. And so the warning to us is that we make sure that we don't act as Israel did in the wilderness, where we rebelled against God. We sought to worship idols, or they sought to worship idols and believe in something created by their own hands rather than what God had revealed of himself to them. And so the warning is that we not lose out on this incredible, gracious gift that God offers to us of new life in Christ. Then in Hebrews chapter 5 through 7, Jesus will be compared to the priests from the line of Aaron, and then to this very mysterious priest, not your kind of mystery, Linda, but a mysterious priest by the name of Melchizedek. And in these chapters, we're going to see Jesus be compared to Israel's priests from the line of Aaron. Aaron was one of Moses' associates, and it was this priesthood that God instituted. And those priests, they had this role and responsibility of representing the people to God and God to the people. And they would offer these sacrifices that Tom mentioned in his communion meditation. These birds and these bulls and these goats and these sheep, these various animals that would be utilized where they would represent the person. A person would be identified with the sacrifice through the laying of their hand on it. That animal would be killed, and that shedding of blood was a temporary removal of sin. But as Tom mentioned, the sacrifice of animals, and we'll see later in Hebrews, is insufficient to actually remove and deal with sin. So some greater sacrifice was needed. But the priests then, they would offer these sacrifices of atonement, it was called, for their own sin and the sin of the people. But those same priests that were offering the sacrifices, they were corrupted by sin. They were morally flawed. And so that meant they had to constantly offer these sacrifices over and over and over. And so that meant something more was needed. Something greater was needed. What was needed was an ultimate priest. And so the author will say that Jesus is that ultimate priest, that Jesus is the ultimate atoning sacrifice. And what's really kind of interesting is that Jesus didn't come from the line of Aaron. We get a lot of in the Gospels, Jesus' lineage, who he's connected to, like David or things like that. But he's not of the line of Aaron. Jesus was a priest, the scriptures say, in the order of Melchizedek. And so this guy was this mysterious priest king who lived in Jerusalem, and he appears just very briefly in the story of Abraham. Abraham, after a battle, he gives to Melchizedek a tithe. And so we don't know a whole lot about Melchizedek. But we see in Psalm 110, we see that this promised Messiah would be a king, yes, in the line of David, but would also be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. And so as we read the Hebrew letter, we see the author making this claim that Jesus is the ultimate priest king. So Jesus, we believe and know, was morally flawless. He was perfect. And he is eternally available for his people. And Jesus is superior to any other mediator between God and humans. So that the priest in the line of Aaron, that priest acted as a mediator, kind of stood between the people and God and the people. But again, that was insufficient. Jesus is the ultimate mediator between us and God. And then with that in mind, the author, again, provides a warning that to reject Jesus is to reject a person's only chance to be in right relationship with God. The only way to be reconciled to God because of our sin is in and through Jesus. We'll then come to Hebrews 8 through 10. And in Hebrews 8 through 10, Jesus is compared to the sacrifices in the old covenant and old promise. The Hebrew author will show how Jesus' death on the cross was this ultimate sacrifice of atonement, and that Jesus is vastly, vastly superior to any animal sacrifice that was offered in the temple. The animal sacrifices, again, they had to be offered day after day and year after year. In contrast, when Jesus offered his life for us on the cross, the scriptures tell us that he did it once for all people. And this one sacrifice was sufficient to deal with the sin of every person who had lived and will live. Jesus dealt with our sin in a way that we cannot. And so we read in Romans, the death that Christ died, he died once. The death Christ died, he died to sin once for all. But the life he lives to God. And then in Hebrews, and by that will we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when the priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. And that priest that offered the sacrifice once and then sat down at the right hand of God is Jesus. So as with all the other comparisons and contrasts, there's a warning that follows the comparison. The warning this time is that walking away from Jesus means you're turning your back on God's gracious gift of forgiveness. Jesus' sacrifice is permanent, and it acts as the foundation for God's new covenant that would be spoken of by the prophets. It was a prediction that there would be an ultimate sacrifice that would completely deal with sin in a way that all sin could be forgiven. We then come to chapter 10, and the author concludes the comparisons and warnings in 10, and we now move into a brief period of encouragement. Hebrews 11 through 13, and the letter will come to an end, and the author is going to offer encouragement to this community of faith who is suffering, who is being persecuted, who is questioning if following Jesus is really the right thing. Is it worthwhile? Would my life be better or easier if I just went back to my old ways? And so he's going to speak into those circumstances. And the author will remind his readers that because of all these comparisons and contrasts, that Jesus, he's the very Word of God. And that Jesus offers a hope for a new life in God's new creation. Because Jesus is an eternal priest and the perfect ultimate sacrifice for sin. And it's for those reasons then he'll say that they should not give up on Jesus, that we should not give up on Jesus, and that we can follow these examples of faith that we see in Hebrews 11. That we should then remain faithful to God, faithful to Jesus. Finally, the author will urge and encourage these suffering Christians to trust God, to trust that despite their hardship, despite their suffering, that God will not abandon them. That's a pretty incredible promise, and one that we need to hold on to when it feels like what's around us is darkness, when we feel like the weight of the world is crushing our soul, is that God will not abandon us. And though it may feel difficult and desperate, what we hold to is that Jesus will never leave us nor forsake us. And that is a promise that he has made to us. Jesus is the clearest, the fullest, and the most ultimate revelation of God. Jesus is worthy then of our total trust and devotion. Following Jesus means remaining faithful to him, whatever our circumstances, whatever our suffering or hardship, because we know that ultimately Jesus has won and that we are with him. And so, whatever your circumstances today, may you continue to trust Jesus. Because I think it would be absolutely foolish to quit now. You've come so far. Don't give up. Don't give up on Jesus when life is hard and difficult. I think one of the most important questions that humanity has to kind of constantly face and wrestle with is, how can I be right with God? How can I, as a sinful human being, how can I approach a holy God? Well, both those are answered in Jesus. How can I be right with God? It's Jesus and faith in him. How can I approach a holy God even as a sinful person? It's Jesus. I want to remind you of what we learned from John's gospel that we just finished studying. John told us that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And by believing in him, we may have life in his name. So from Hebrews, from John, Jesus is all we need. Jesus is all you need. And that is the message of the letter of Hebrews. Worship team.